make a statement only. And I would not want you to take it much further than that. But the westernization begins abroad for the immigrant Muslim here. That's my point. No matter where he or she comes from. Now, I said that first-generation Muslim immigrants have overwhelmingly left societies which were or are in one stage or another of social and political westernization. On the whole, the home societies of recent immigrants have not chosen, on the whole, the home societies of recent immigrants have not chosen Islamic law and ethics as the bases of governance and social interaction. However, recent Muslim immigrants hail from societies in which some degree of cultural Islamization has occurred over centuries. And here I distinguish between the Muslim convert and the Islamization of that person, or the degree of Islamization of that person, and the immigrant. The recent Muslim immigrants hail from societies in which some degree of cultural Islamization has occurred over centuries. The ways by which this happened is another subject and need not deter us. But I say to students of the sociology of knowledge and the social history of Muslim Americans, I say to you, there is much to be gained from a study of Islamization of Muslim Americans. There's much to be gained. For our present purpose, suffices to say that there seems to be a correlation between lack of direct reference to Islamic sources in Muslim societies and inculcation of Judeo-Christian social values in the United States. There is a correlation between the two. We can talk about this later if you like. There is an evident similarity amongst the ethical values and concepts of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There is an evident similarity amongst the ethical concepts and values of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And even amongst these, i.e. Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, there is a similarity in ethical concepts amongst those, and on the other hand, what? Buddhism, Hinduism, and African traditional religions. Definitely so. But in the case of Muslim, African, and European American converts, the continual secularization of American society has effectively discouraged important shared values amongst the ethical and moral systems of Christianity and Judaism. And Muslims have inherited most of their values from American society, not mostly from Islam. Thus, for the ordinary adherent, to be a Muslim is more a matter of basic beliefs and rituals. We just participated in one over there. To be a Muslim is more a matter of basic beliefs and rituals than of actions and ethics. Intentional and systematic inculcation of Islamic personal and social values and behavior, irrespective of age, seems to receive far too little attention in Muslim circles. Thus, the authority of Islamic law and ethics whether from the Quran or the Sunnah, continues to receive less obedience and even attention, mere attention, than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would seem to wish, based on his revelation and the authenticated sayings and deeds of his messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Both the Quran and the Sunnah are the basic sources of Islamic law and ethics, as the United States Constitution, the Quran and the Sunnah are not the only basic sources of Islamic law and ethics in practical terms. They're not. But conceptually, they are. And I'm not sure that I have not gotten into trouble here, because I said something here that I said they are not the basic sources, they're only the basic sources conceptually. And I hope no one take me to task at the end. But that's not what I really wanted to say, Imam Wahiddin. That's not what I really wanted to say. What I really wanted to say, this happens in my classroom and conferences also. You know, I've been thinking about this for years, and I'd really like some feedback if you like it. But bear with me. What I'm saying here is that the Quran and the Sunnah, what I have in print here, is that the Quran and the Sunnah are only the basic sources of Islamic law and ethics. Which means the same thing, I think. The Quran and the Sunnah are only the basic sources of what? Of Islamic law and ethics. As the US Constitution is only the basic source of US law. Or as a tree's roots are only the basis of the tree. Indeed, a trunk and branches are so important to the idea of tree that without them one hardly imagines a tree. The Quran and the Sunnah are only the basic sources of Islamic law and ethics. In the absence of Quranic and Sunnah specificity, in the absence of, can one think of a situation in which one does not find the explicit, specific answer to it in the Quran and in the Sunnah? Yes. Yes. Many. Now, in the absence of Quranic and Sunnah specificity, Muslim jurists have frequently been compelled to seek legal answers in the second and third sources of the so-called Sunni schools of law, or madhahib, the plural of madhab. Now, these two sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, the two sources which Muslims have turned to when they did not find the answer, let's say, in the Quran and the Sunnah, they have turned to two other sources they have turned to ijma', which equals consensus, and to qiyas, which means analogy or analogical reasoning. Right? These two sources are consensus or ijma' and analogical reasoning qiyas respectively. Both of these sources have rules and are tools of legally trained specialists. They are not to be used by the legally untrained. Due to the geographical smallness of the early Muslim state, with its capital at Medina, consensus of opinion on many matters amongst the Prophet's companions was a relatively easy matter. Later, however, with the extension of Muslim-ruled lands, consensus or scholarly opinion became somewhat complex and difficult to achieve. This was due not only to greater distances and thus diminution in circumstances or in communications. So it wasn't due to that only. Dissimilarities in cultural milieus, interpretation of historical events, and even the basic sources of law also made scholarly consensus on various questions difficult across schools of thought and within single schools. Dissimilarities in cultural milieus. Arabia is not Morocco. Muslims in Arabia did not come from exactly the same cultural milieu from which came the Moroccans. Nigerian Muslims do not come from exactly the same cultural milieu from which Kenyan Muslims on the other side of the African continent. No, they're not the same. They're not the same. Not the same at all. Now, that's one. Then, another dissimilarity, now that's dissimilarity in cultural milieu. Another kind of dissimilarity was interpretation. How did we interpret, how did any society or the scholars in that society, how did they interpret historical events? For to say that the Prophet migrated from Medina to Mecca, from Mecca to Medina, how do we interpret that? What does that mean to us? I'm coming to that a bit later. To say that the Quran says, and I know quite well that I'm going to open up a can of worms here now. To say, and I'm doing it purposely. I mean, Imam knows me well. I'm going to do something here. Look, to say, for the Quran to say, lock them or put them in their quarters, women.
Yes.
I opened up more than a can of worms, right? Very good, we'll all go fishing. You know, that was said in a context. That was said in a context. Now, that was said in an historical context. Something happened, and that verse was revealed. So therefore, when, perhaps when you're sitting at home and reading this verse, your reaction to this verse in 1996, 13 October 1996, your reaction to that verse is also occurring within an historical context and within a social and cultural context which may not be Muslim at all. But you're Muslims. The interpretation of that verse in the year 700 of the current era in, let's say, China and Senegal may have been different also. And thus, Muslims differ in their perceptions and their interpretation of texts. which are clearly stated, they may differ in their interpretation. As one of my professors said to me early in my career, in my student career, every time a person makes a statement, the person has made another statement. And those of you who study philosophy know that very well. Once I tell you my name is Akbar, I have just told you a lot of other things. My name is not Jim, not James, not Donald, it's Akbar. So I have made a lot of other statements. Once I say that I'm here in the Wardis Cultural and Research Center, I have said that I'm not back home. Once you say that the Prophet said this or that the Quran said this, there are also other statements that they make. Now when we add to those our interpretations, and we come from different social backgrounds and all of this sort of thing, right? It makes things a bit difficult. It makes things a bit difficult to unify all these people. Anyway, in any case, I want your participation good. Interpretation of historical events and even the basic sources of law, i.e. the Quran and the Sunnah, also made scholarly consensus on various questions difficult across schools of thought and within schools. Thus, consensus was often local. Right? Often consensus was local. Local consensus was affected by recognition of a people's custom or urf as a basis for the issuance of legal opinions or fatwas. Local consensus was affected by recognition of a people's custom or urf as a basis for the issuance of legal opinions or fatwas. Theoretically, a Muslim people's customs must not contradict the Quran, the Sunnah, and the widely accepted consensus or ijma'. Theoretically. But local consensus might differ due to the existence of more than one school or sub-schools in a given locality. Again. Local consensus may differ due to the existence of more than one school or sub-schools in a given locality. Historically, some schools and scholars were official, to the extent that Muslim rulers or the political establishments favored them as sources of legitimate decisions and actions. However, this has never precluded scholarly differences. Nor did the existence of official schools, sub-schools, scholarly and not so scholarly persons who had great influence in segments of Muslim populations prevent others from gaining a following. Ethnic biases, interest groups, and persons with other than purely Islamic interests were always present and often vocal. Lack of specificity or silence of the Quran and the Sunnah and localization of consensus facilitate legitimately or illegitimately responses to situations which involve only one part of the international Muslim community. Lack of specificity of the Quran and the Sunnah and localization of consensus facilitate, these two things facilitate, legitimately or illegitimately, responses to situations which involve only one part or only part of the international Muslim community. An historical approach to the development of the Sharia reveals that legal opinions not infrequently resulted from conditions of Muslims in a particular locality. It is interesting to observe that the jurists, or the fuqaha, outside the regions in which the conditions obtained were often asked for rulings. Let me make that clear. I stated earlier that when it comes to minority-majority relations, Islamic law has much more to say, much more to say about non-Muslim minorities within the Muslim majority state. Right? 10 to 12 million Christians live in Egypt, of a total population of 60 to 65 million. There about 10 to 12 million Christians there. They've been there long before the Muslims came. And what has happened over the years and over the centuries is that most of the Christians have converted to Islam. But though Islam appeared, as I said last night to some of you who had dinner with us, Islam came to Egypt in 639. And by 641, most of the country was under Muslim rule, under Muslim domination. And by 645, the last of the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire, right? Most of the Byzantines had withdrawn from Alexandria, Egypt, which was a naval base for them. Very important naval base also. What am I saying? I'm saying now that this is the introduction of Muslims into Egypt as rulers. I'd better say something else. No, they didn't go into Egypt just like that and took the, no. Oh, they intended to take the country. But the Christians who lived in Egypt were agents of the Muslims. They did not like their masters, the Byzantines, who taxed them very heavily. And Pope Benjamin helped the Muslims and provided guides for the Muslims. Hoping for what? One, that you won't force us to leave Christianity, and two, that you won't increase our tax burden. Rather, you will relieve us of some of those taxes that the Byzantines have imposed upon us. This is very important for you to understand. But over the years, as the years progressed, most of the population of Egypt became Muslim. But it took 300 years almost for that to happen, because they were not forced to convert. But something that happens in the United States, you cannot. Those Egyptian Christians could not, stay side by side with Muslims for long. The process, you're going to start becoming like them for one reason or another. You're going to start becoming like them. You're going to start accepting their values. Rather, there's going to be an interaction, in fact, here. They are going to affect, the rulers are going to be affected also by those who they rule. Clearly. All right. So, what we have here, therefore, is a situation in which the ulama gave more attention to that minority which was not Muslim in Islamic law than to a Muslim minority living in a non-Muslim society, non-Muslim majority society. Indeed, there are many non-Muslim. We can certainly talk about several non-Muslim. We can talk about several Muslim minorities who lived in a non-Muslim majority state. I mean, I'm sure that some of you know about southern Spain, Andalusia. I mean, there you have especially after the Spanish reconquest, I mean, we have here really a small Muslim minority living in a majority non-Muslim state. Now, if we are now going to, we as a minority in the state, if we now want to find out what does Islamic law say about our obligations, responsibilities to the non-Muslim, to our non-Muslim rulers, who do we ask about? Well, one, what I'm proposing here is something that has been proposed elsewhere also, that most of those, it appears that most of those requests for Islamic legislation on this question, or legal opinion on this question, was directed, the questions were directed to to Muslim scholars who lived in predominantly Muslim lands. I hope that's clear.
Yes.
That's what I meant by that jurists or fuqaha outside the regions in which the conditions obtained were often asked for rulings. Reference was doubtless made to jurists and or other ulama in the localities as well. If one investigates certain questions, one finds differences amongst legal experts which are not always due to differences in places of residence. One finds, if one looks at the questions that the fuqaha or the jurists answered, that the differences are not the differences between, let's say, the Shafi'is and the Malikis, the Hanafis and the Hanbalis, the so-called Sunnis and the Shi'is. Not always are those differences due to differences in place of residence. Not always will the difference between a scholar in Tehran, Iran, be different from one in Rabat, Morocco, simply because they live in two different geographical areas. That's what I'm trying to say here. Now, and taken together, the different opinions evidence the variety of seemingly legitimate choices a Muslim has when faced by various types of problems. I'm saying here, and I want this to be understood the way I mean it, because I understand, I mean, I can think of some possible twisting of this statement here, or misunderstanding of the statement. What I'm saying here is, first of all, we can have differences of opinion because of geographical areas, but that is not the only reason that there will be differences of opinion amongst legal scholars. I'm saying that be that as it may, what we have, what this creates, however, or what this confronts us with, is a number of different opinions on sometimes the same topics, the same questions. Difference is there, and difference is often encouraged in scholarly circles. But what does that do for the ordinary Muslim? For the ordinary Muslim, differences of opinion contributes to the variety or gives the ordinary Muslim several solutions, several legitimate solutions to problems.